So Mark will talk for about 25 minutes. After that, we'll open for discussions, and I'd ask you to put your blue hand up or your yellow hand or whatever colour your hand is, but your electronic hand to indicate that you'd like to talk, and then we'll call people forward for contributions. People will have 3 minutes. I will hold up a sign like this when you've got to 2 minutes in, so that you know you've only got 1 minute left, and gently interrupt you. And then I'll hold up this sign saying 3 minutes when you've come to the end. Please try and stick to your time so that we can get in as many people as possible. So I'll pass over now to Mark and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina, and welcome, comrades. What's gone wrong with our unions? It's a big topic, and one that urgently needs addressing, and questions of leadership are going to loom large in what I'm going to say, and I'm going to try and explore and explain. Let me start, though, with just giving you a couple of quotes, which I think illustrate some of the problems that we face. They're from two senior trade union figures. The first is from the new General Secretary of Unison, which is currently the biggest union in Britain with 1.4 million members. It's Christine McAnear, who was elected in January. And in one of her first interviews, I think it was Radio 4 on Women's Hour, actually, she said this: we are the kind of union that takes a position that you don't threaten strike action and then don't follow through on it. If we talk about taking strike action, we know it's difficult. We represent lots of low-paid workers. We don't take them out on strike willingly because they lose pay. And she went on to criticise other unions, unnamed, who apparently talk too much about strike action. The second quote is from a current Assistant General Secretary of the second biggest union in Britain, Unite, and one of the contenders in the current General Secretary election to replace Len McCluskey, who's stepping down. It's Steve Turner. And he put out this message on Christmas Eve, actually. Now, it was in the context of the Brexit deal being signed, but I think it has wider application than that. And he said, we will continue to campaign with our members and work alongside industry. Who is industry if it's not his he means the employers. The new year will bring a need to roll up our sleeves in the national interest, and build the broadest alliance with employers to safeguard and advance the long-term interests of our manufacturing heartlands. Now, perhaps I've been a bit unfair picking on those two individuals, because there could be other people you could highlight. Some people think this, but don't say it in public and so on. But what do we have here? On the one hand, I think we have McAnear really presenting a picture that says, you know, workers don't want to strike, unions don't want to strike, our members are too poor, too vulnerable, striking is just a last resort. It's a vision of workers as passive victims who can't really confront their employers. So, you know, you lot should stop talking about strikes and so on. On the other, and I think that's connected, is Turner saying we have to aim at an alliance between the unions and employers to pressurise government to intervene, to protect and shore up industry, to make sure business is profitable, because that's how you maintain and defend jobs. Now, I mean, these are quite extraordinary arguments, really, when you think about it. Is our problem in the British trade union movement, as it stands, that we're far too willing to go on strike? I mean, let's just remind ourselves here. In the 1970s, as an average across the whole decade, which means that some years were higher than this, British workers took, they always say lost in the figures, but they took 13.2 million strike days on average each year. In the 1980s, which was a decade, you know, that saw more defeats and victories, it's the great 84-84 miners' strike and so on. In that decade, the average was lower, but it was still 8.7 million, if memory serves, on average a year. Since 1990, that's the last 3 decades, there has been no single year with more than 2 million official days of strike action. Now, the strike figures don't capture everything, but the basic trend here is right. that we have seen far too few strikes, and actually has the position of the working class improved from that low level of strike action? You might think that McInerney might see some connection between the deep problems of low pay of large numbers of her members and the unwillingness to strike. They're connected. It's allowed bosses to drive down wages and to attack conditions. And the flip side, the argument about effectively social partnership allying with employers, that is somehow the notion that workers' interests, jobs, pay, pensions, conditions, and so on, are tied to what are sometimes euphemistically talked about as the viability and efficiency. Let's be blunt, profitability is what's being argued here. If bosses are profitable, we get good jobs. If bosses are not profitable, they attack us. And therefore we have to defend the efficiency and profitability of firms. The problem, and you really don't have to have read all 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital, although you should, comrades, to know that profits, how do they make profits? How the firms become profitable? Precisely by squeezing workers to make them work harder for less pay and so on. So this is a disastrous response. So we have this conundrum that trade unions, which are established and attract people to join them as the basic defense organizations of workers against their employer at work, have become, in the last few decades, all too poor at precisely defending the basic interests of workers against employers. And, part of the reason for this is that what's the nature of trade unions? Trade unions don't exist to abolish capitalism. They exist to seek to negotiate the terms of workers' exploitation within capitalism, not to abolish exploitation. When the system is booming, expanding, like it was in the post-war decades, the 30, 40 years after the Second World War, the sort of push for reforms, for benefits for workers, for concessions from the employer, doesn't seriously clash with the basic underlying profitability. The times are good. You can push for reforms. When you enter a crisis, as we have been over the last few decades, it can lead to an acceptance not to push too hard, otherwise you jeopardize the profitability of the employer. And that's the kind of logic that much of the unions then drift into, unless they face serious pressure, above all from the rank and file, from ordinary workers and so on, to fight back. This might sound a bit abstract, but I remember, some of you may have been there, there was a very interesting meeting, the People Before Profit meeting, back late May. And I remember Mark Sawatka, who's the General Secretary of the PCS Civil Servants Union, who spoke at the meeting with Charlie Kimber yesterday, had come from a TUC General Council where senior members of all the unions meet, and certainly all the big unions. And Mark described really that, without again quite naming names, but I think we knew who he meant, that the big unions, and I think he maybe meant the 3 big unions, Unite, Unison and the GMB, really had an attitude of not seeking to fight to extend or even to maintain the lockdown against the ravages of the COVID pandemic. And when the National Education Union in the schools responded to Johnson wanting to have a wider reopening, particularly of primaries on June the 1st, if you remember back to last year, and they issued Section 44 notices and pushed Johnson back. They stopped him doing it on anything like the scale he wanted to for several weeks, and no doubt saving lives in the process. It was a fantastic example that you could fight, but there was no wider generalization. Unite didn't push to shut down the construction sites, Unison didn't mobilize its members, and so on and so forth. They were left on their own to fight because of this acceptance that you had to get the profit machine working. Otherwise, there'd be a tax on jobs. There wouldn't be the taxes to pay for public services and so on. You see how that logic blunts resistance. Now, this also then leads to another big problem. It doesn't address what we also know is part of what's gone wrong with the unions, isn't it? Which is there has been a decline in the size of overall trade union membership and the reach of the unions into whole new sectors of industry that have grown up in the last 30, 40 years. Think about the IT industry, think about places like Amazon. where the unions often don't reach. If you don't fight, you shrink. A couple of figures, 1979, 13 million people in trade unions, that was a peak. It'd been lower at other points, but that's a peak. 13 million, it's about half that today. It's about half that today. And the reality is that trade union organisation has never been built through insurance schemes, through press releases, or even through good organising departments and reps training, although I'm very much in favour of those. It's been built through waves of struggle. This is how the trade union movement in Britain has always been built. In the late 1880s, the new unionism, which extended trade union organisation from the kind of comfort zone of skilled trades and skilled workers into unskilled workers, the dockers strike, the match women, actually often, 14, 15-year-old Irish migrants in the Brighton and May factory, the great famous match women strike, and so on. That laid the basis for unions like the Transport and General Workers, the GMB, and so on. The years before the First World War, where the labour unrest, as it was called, shook Victorian Britain, and again, massive expansion of trade union organisation. The mid-30s, when strikes and militancy built union organisation in the new light industries, aviation, car production, places like the giant Park Royal estate in West London and up through Northwest London, Coventry, Oxford, the Dagenham Ford plant, just a couple of miles away from where I'm talking to you now. That's how the unions broke into those new sectors and were established, or all the way, the huge strikes in the late 60s and early 70s spread trade union organisation to new groups of workers like in the public sector, health workers, the schools, civil servants, and so on. It's struggle that builds organisation. And conversely, when you don't struggle, union organisation begins to shrink and it has less reach into wider sections of the working class. Now, we don't see anything like that today on that scale, but we do see some glimpses, a taste of what could be possible if we saw more resistance and more militancy. I'll give you just two examples, and there are others. One on a bigger scale, which is, just to return to the National Education Union again, when it issued those Section 44 notices last June, and then again at the beginning of this year, and engaged its members in a huge fight for safety in schools, not only did it push the Tories back twice, but it put on, I think at least 20,000 new members were recruited and thousands of new reps in schools. In other words, that argument you sometimes pick up in the unions that, oh, we can't fight, we have to get more organised. Organisation comes first. Then at some point in the future, which never seems to come, then we'll be ready to fight. It's an old argument put by Rosa Luxemburg, the Polish-German revolutionary, in her great pamphlet a century ago, The Mass Strike. Struggle builds organisation. When unions fight, people join them. And new leaders emerge who become the reps and so on that will drive that organisation forward. A smaller scale, but again, I think quite an inspiring glimpse of what's possible. People may know in London particularly, but starting to be elsewhere, there are kind of newer, smaller unions that have emerged, like the United Voices of the World, the IWGB, Kaiwu, the Care Workers Union. There's a union called the Courier and Apps Workers Union, who organise Uber drivers, delivery. And it's just, probably the combined membership of them, which used to be probably in the high hundreds 4 or 5 years ago, it's probably about 10,000, I would guess now, it's the approximate figure. So I don't want to exaggerate the scale, but the fact that they have organised, often migrant cleaners or people who work in nursing homes or Uber drivers and so on, doing what the big unions should be doing, but are often failing to be doing because they don't think it's worthwhile and so on, gives you a glimpse again of the potential. And they take a much more combative and militant approach in order to build organisation. Now, the difficulty here is that the deep problems that we see in the unions, we can't simply take an attitude of kind of contemplation and commentary towards them. These are urgent, and increasingly, I think, as a crisis, because precisely what we face with the COVID crisis, where we've paid a huge price already in terms of the incredible number of deaths that have taken place in Britain, thanks to the criminal policies of the Tories. And we know there's going to be a further price paid out in jobs and austerity. And I think we're at a fork in the road. Either we are going to see a kind of rebooted austerity that we faced after the great financial crisis 10, 11 years ago, and we're going to see that on an even higher scale, but probably with a greater level of job losses, especially once the furlough scheme is withdrawing. And I think with some of the attacks we're seeing around fire and rehire, where some quite big employers like British Gas driving through not slow, gradual attacks on the workforce, but major attacks, costing people thousands of pounds a year. There is a choice here. Do we carry on with business as usual of weakening organisation, weakening level of resistance and so on, or do we massively escalate the level of resistance that's capable of infusing workers, generating new leaders in the workplace, and extending the reach of the trade unions to whole new sectors of workers, including young workers? And I think there has to be a break with the kind of business as usual pattern that we've seen build up over decades. And that means a fight for a change of direction. Now, it's all very well to say that. How do we do it? Now, I think that first thing to say, there is a place for challenges, internal union elections to the existing leaderships. I mentioned Unison and Unite at the beginning. In Unison, there are national executive elections taking place. The left-wing challenger to Christine McAnear, Paul Holmes, got probably the biggest vote the left has got in decades in the union. There's now an attempt, which is, a serious one. There is a prospect the left could take control of the national executive of Unison. This would be not everything, but it'd be a step forward. In the Unite General Secretary election, there's a right-winger, Gerald Coyne, there's Steve Turner, who I mentioned, but there are also challenges to the left of Turner, a man called Howard Beckett, who's very, very hard on Starmer, and says many, many good things, but I think is a little bit less to say about how he would break from the kind of business as usual and develop Unite's fighting capacity, or Sharon Graham, who's the head of the union's organising department, who is talking about rebuilding workplace organisation and indeed of unionising new sectors. She says Unite will launch a drive to organise Amazon, which is quite an eye-catching argument. I think there are weaknesses in what Sharon says, but the SWP is supporting Sharon Graham. Precisely because she does talk about breaking from that business as usual and says, if we carry on the way we are, it's just managed decline. And this is the kind of debate we have to have. However, the problems we face are deeper than simply the faces at the top of the union. So the decades of defeats and retreats have also taken their toll in the ranks of the people who hold the union movement together, often over decades, in often quite difficult circumstances. And there can be a shrinking of horizon, a retreat from organising to just casework, of at worst sitting in the union office, not really connecting much with the members, of small union meetings that aren't very welcoming. Some of this may be familiar to some people. It's taken its cost deeper into the ranks as well. And also that therefore also means that, too many workplaces where there is unionisation, workplace organisation is quite weak. There's no rep, or the rep isn't active, and so on and so forth. And this is a real problem that we have to address. And in that context, what do we face amongst the sort of wider mass of trade union members and the wider working class? We know, alongside the anger and bitterness about what's being done to our lives, there is also fear about challenging bullying managers. What will that mean for how you're treated at work? Or maybe even, to threaten to your job if you stand up and fight back. And that therefore, if people want to think about fighting back, but putting their head above the parapet, people want to know, do they have a power to make a difference? Will they get support in their workplace? And indeed, amongst the wider trade union and working class movement. And that to me means that socialists, as well as arguing and criticising what those at the top of the movement do, have to give a lead themselves about building workplace organisation, building a culture of regular trade union meetings that are welcoming and well publicised, of putting an argument when you're under attack from an employer that there should be a fight back. Doesn't mean you'll always win it, but it has to be put, these arguments, in a patient and serious, credible way, that we have to be raising solidarity when other groups of workers go into strike action, and introducing conversations about strikes and militancy into our work. We have to be organisers and fighters, creating a collective culture. in our workplaces. However, that's not enough, is it? And that brings me back to the question of what national leaderships do matters. Because precisely in a context in which often there isn't that confidence, there isn't enough examples of people winning, people don't always feel their power. If they're given confidence or a lead from the top, it can make a real difference. And therefore, you know, official leads or lack of them make a huge difference. Again, I'll give you an example. On the 3rd of January, Boris Johnson said schools would have to reopen after Christmas, even though the COVID pandemic was raging at the point, as we all remember. The GMB union and the NAS, teachers union, said this was an appalling thing to do. They were opposed to it, but they wouldn't issue Section 44 notices. Unison did issue Section 44 notices, it has 200,000 members in schools, and it emailed that directly to all members, very, very helpful. What was interesting is the NEU went one step further, and I think it's a crucial step because it addresses that question of confidence as well. It issued Section 44 notices, but it called an online meeting of its members, which I think, sometimes people talk about 300,000-400,000 watching it. I think that's a slight exact. I think about 80,000 people were watching that meeting at any one point. And it's not just that they heard very effective, 5 or 6 effective arguments from their 2 general secretaries, which they did. But if you're in a meeting with 80,000 people, what you think is, if I go to my head on Monday and say, we're not coming in under Section 44 because it's not safe, you think, is it just our school doing it? Are we just putting out and we're going to get destroyed? If you look around and there's 80,000 on an online meeting, you're confident everybody's having a go at it. And that's crucial to giving people that confidence. Thanks, Nina. Now that means that whenever there's an official call, we have to seize on it, even when it's utterly limited. When Unison called for a slow hand clap in the hospitals over the pay offer from the government, the measly 1%, you could respond by saying, this is inadequate, which it was, be utterly cynical about the union, which should be justified. Or, however, you can say, it's inadequate, but we are going to organise ward by ward across our hospital to draw people collectively together, perhaps have a protest outside the hospital like they did at Homerton in East London or UCL in Central London, and use it to build organisation. You have to seize those opportunities to try to expand the level of rank and file activity and workplace organisation. That's what we mean by talking about with and against the union leaders. Third point, before I come to conclusion, I think there's a question of leadership here as well around, we have to reject, and it's an old notion, particularly entrenched in the British trade union movement, which is that unions do bread and butter, pay, wages and so on. Politics is what goes on in the Parliamentary Labour Party in Parliament for your constituents. We have to reject that separation of politics and economics. And you still hear these arguments expressed in union meetings and so on. Yeah, we don't want to bring politics into it. So, on the contrary, we have to fight to bring politics and the spirit of the social movements that we've seen. The lack of level of struggle overall doesn't mean there's a lack of anger or political questioning. Think about the revolts that we've seen in the streets around the climate walkouts by students. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement we saw last summer. Think about the revolt over Sarah Everard's murder and then the Kill the Bill. We have to bring that into workplaces and in very concrete ways. Can you get a trade union banner to a Kill the Bill protest with some of your colleagues from work? On the 25th of May, it will be the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. Stand Up to Racism and the TUC, again, that official little door opening there, have called on people at work to take the knee in solidarity. And if we had thousands, or better still, tens of thousands of workplaces, and not just 1 or 2 people taking a selfie, that's the most you can get, but can you get 50 of your colleagues outside your workplace taking the knee? Hundreds of colleagues in a massive workplace, and so it would be a blow against racism and for a fight for unity of the workplace, but it will also help you build union organisation by raising people's confidence and I think throwing up new activists. So we have to reject a narrow bread and butter approach, and questions of oppression are central. I mean, the working class in Britain, the trade union movement is actually incredibly diverse. Unison is probably the biggest female membership organisation in Britain. It has 1 million women members. Black workers are actually more likely to be in a trade union than their white counterparts. Questions around LGBT rights. The the unions in the 1980s were actually pioneers around this. See the film Pride if you want to know more about some of this. Look at questions of trans rights. I'll tell you, for all the limitations of the unions, again and again, unions have very good policy around trans rights. These things have been debated, discussed at national conferences of hundreds and past. I mean, Usdaw, the shop worker, you don't always look to Usdaw for inspiration. I was amazed when I went to their conference to see that they had very good policy on trans rights. Now, there's one or two people at the top of our union movements that I think are poor on this question at times. But frankly, I think they're out of step with a huge parts of these membership. We have to take up these questions. Here's my final argument then before I shut up and Nina mutes me. And I think it follows. All of this means we all have to be active workplace organisers, building trade unionism, building a culture of collective organisation and resistance at work. However, it's not enough just to be a trade unionist. And I think there is a danger at the minute. I think we need a big break from an orientation on the internal battles where the left is in defeat in the Labour Party. But there's a danger that people either retreat simply into kind of serial, episodic, single issue campaigns, or simply into being good trade unionists. And I think we need a bigger network of socialists who draw on those kind of experiences and those kind of wider arguments, and not just as individual socialists, but as an organised network of socialists. And again, there has been a red thread that has always run through the building and the rebuilding of the British working class movement. In the new unionism, Eleanor Marx, Marx's daughter, played a central role organising the gas workers who became the forerunner of the modern GMB. In the labour unrest, revolutionary syndicalists like Tom Mann, who often became the founder members of the Revolutionary Communist Party after the Russian Revolution in the early 1920s. In the post-war years, it's no longer a revolutionary party, and it certainly had its limits, but networks around the Communist Party were central to those battles, like in the 1970s, sometimes the revolutionary left. Now, those networks have eroded. If we want to rebuild the trade union movement, it has to go hand in hand with building a bigger network of organised socialists. And I think at its heart, that needs a bigger network of revolutionary socialists organised together. That's what the SWP is trying to do, precisely because we reject the idea of the separation of politics and economics. We place workers as having the power to paralyse capitalism by how they organise and ultimately to overthrow it. But let's start with challenging it. And we act as tribunes of the oppressed who don't see those kind of political questions and questions as somehow irrelevant to building at work. We think they're utterly central. And therefore, this is not an easy road, but this is, to me, is the only road of how we're going to rebuild serious working class organisation that can make sure that fork in that road isn't austerity 2.0, but is a much higher level of resistance. Thanks, Nina.